So now you move into your project. So these are the things that you need to consider when picking a trans for your project. Okay, so obviously the simple one, does it bolt up to my engine? So if it doesn't bolt to your engine, then you'll have to worry about adapter plates, or creating your own type of adapters, to bolt it up. The second one is, does it even fit in my application? If you've ever seen a 6L80, 6L90 trans, they're not much larger than what you would typically expect. It's the shape of them that is different. And so because that shape is different, they don't fit in traditional tunnels very well. And so that's one thing you have to consider if you want to use one of these newer transmissions is, will it even fit in my tunnel, or am I going to have to cut the tunnel out? Second thing is the transmission capable of even holding up in my application? So is it sized appropriately for the weight and power of the vehicle? Now this can be confusing for some people because you may not always need the big transmission. If you've got a small tire and you've got a small lightweight car, at some point it's not going to matter how big your transmission is. It's also not going to matter how much power you have. You can have 1,000 horsepower, you can have 500 horsepower. If it starts to spin at 300 horsepower, then it doesn't do you any good to go with a trans that'll hold 1,000 horsepower because you're not going to be able to break it. So there's some tricks you can do there. Where if you have a high-powered, lightweight, small-tire vehicle, you can get away with smaller trans. You don't need to go with the big trans in those applications. So next is there a controller option available for the trans? What that means is, if I take this trans and I put it in my HRIA, can I even control it? And so we have definitely run into this before where people just assume there's a module out there for the trans that they want to use, and they call us when it's too late. They've already fitted the trans in there, and we're like, well, we don't have anything for it. And so we try to help people out as much as we can. If you get into a situation like that, we'll do the best that we can to set something up for you, but we can't guarantee that we'll have everything that you need. And then there are things to consider what else is needed to operate that trans. And we'll get into the connection requirements here shortly. So next is your budget. Obviously, newer transmissions are going to be more expensive. And so obviously if your budget doesn't call for a $4,000 transmission, you might want to opt for one of the cheaper options. And then you have to worry about your wiring and electronics. So the newer transmissions require more electronics, more wiring. They're more difficult to work with, so with that comes more wiring. And are you comfortable using a laptop or small handheld tuner? If you're a type of person who just doesn't like a laptop, then you don't have to worry. There are options out there where you never need a laptop. So it's just one thing to consider when you're picking your module and picking your transmission. So you might pick a transmission module combination that doesn't require a laptop but does everything that you need it to do, and it saves you later on down the road from having to worry about tuning and calibrating this thing with a laptop. And then also, what's the support level like for my trans? Meaning that if you're using the trans above its design capability, are there parts available for it? If it's a trans that's relatively difficult to calibrate, are there a lot of people using it that can help me with the tuning? We may have base calibrations to get you close to what you need. So once you've chosen your control module, these are the requirements that all of the control modules in the aftermarket need. Got to have power and ground. You got to have some type of throttle position. Vehicle speed typically comes from the transmission, but not on all applications. Some applications, the vehicle speed sensor is located elsewhere on the vehicle, particularly the E4OD and the NAG1. So the Chrysler NAG1 never had a speed sensor in the trans for output shaft speed or for vehicle speed. It always got it from the ABS module. So in those applications, something has to be fabricated or cobbled together to get vehicle speed to the control module. Brake light's not required, but typically recommended. And that's really for panic brake situations, so you get the converter unlocked as quick as possible. On some modules, it's used also for grade detection. So if you step on the brake and the vehicle continues to pick up speed, thinks you're on a downhill grade, and will do a downshift for you to try to slow the vehicle down. Same thing with engine RPM. It's not a requirement by any means. none of the shifting parameters are typically based on RPM except for your wide open throttle shifts. So that's the only thing that's RPM based in the shifting parameters. But what RPM is used for is diagnostics, and most of the diagnostics have an RPM requirement. So if you omit RPM, you really are limited on the diagnostics that you can get after that. And then last is CAN, which you may or may not be familiar with what CAN is. But basically, CAN is the communications network that's used in all vehicles now. And on most engine applications that have a CAN network, we can get the information that we need. So we can get throttle position, we can get brake light, we get engine RPM. We'll get all that information from the CAN, which means you don't have to hook those wires up. A good example of that is the GM crate motor applications. So on those applications, you're not hooking any of that stuff up. Everything is either pre-wired for you, or we already get it from the CAN network. Throttle position can actually be shared with other existing sensors. So if you already have a throttle position sensor, chances are we can just share that with whatever module is already using it. If you're using a carburetor, then there are kits. Look, we have kits, and there are aftermarket kits available to put a throttle position sensor onto a carburetor. If you're using a drive-by-wire system, then we generally recommend that you use pedal position, and that's because your desired shifting is based on the driver's demand, which is what the pedal is. The actual throttle blade is not an indication of what the driver wants. So in those applications, we recommend you use pedal position and not drive-by-wire. And like I said earlier, most of these, typically these parameters can be obtained over CAN. So if your ECU has CAN, we can get the parameters that we need from there. This is an example of a upshift and downshift set. So this is where the vehicle would upshift and where it would downshift based on throttle position and vehicle speed, which shows you the importance of throttle position and vehicle speed. So you can see we have to know how fast the vehicle is going, and we have to know what the driver is requesting the transmission to do, which is what throttle position indicates. Also, throttle position, typically on your typical application, throttle position drives the pressure control in the trans. So this is an example of a pressure control scheme for a 4L60. This is a 100 horsepower diesel engine connected to a 4L60. So this gives you an idea of what the pressures look like. So as you get familiar with these numbers, they'll make sense to you. You'll see that that's almost minimum pressure in the trans most of the time. The other things to consider are your mechanical interface to the vehicle. So your cooler lines and your cooler. Placement of the cooler, size of the cooler is important. Your neutral safety, how are you going to get that? What does it need to be wired into? A shift lever. Obviously, the transmissions don't have shift levers on them. You'll have to create one or use an aftermarket shifter or fit in a factory shifter. The other option is you can use what's called our GSM, which is a push-button shifter that would replace your normal mechanical shift lever. Wiring of your reverse lights. Obviously, you have to remember to wire that stuff up. And then one of the more commonly forgotten ones is the speedometer drive. So if you're using an older vehicle that's got a mechanically driven speedometer and you want to keep the factory gauges, then when you stick an electronic transmission in it, you lose that capability. So there are options out there available for correcting that problem. And then you have to worry about whether you have a four-wheel drive application or not. And the only thing that drives anything on the control module in terms of four-wheel drive is simply where the vehicle speed sensor is located. Because if it's located on the output shaft of the transfer case, then you have to tell the control module when you're in four-wheel drive low so that it can correct its speed readings. Okay, so how do we choose a TCM for our application? Obviously, the first and foremost is it even compatible with my trans that I want to use? And so that'll dictate typically whether it's a first gen or second gen or a mechatronic style transmission will dictate which control module that you choose. Second is ease of use. Are you afraid of a laptop, or do you prefer a laptop? Diagnostics is a very important one that's typically skipped over in the aftermarket. Is what diagnostics are actually available for the trans, and how capable are those diagnostics. And what may or may not be important to some people are what parameters can I even adjust. So some of the modules don't allow you to adjust everything. Some of them fix some parameters for you and limit you on others. What's the technical support like? So, does the company that you're going to get the module from provide good technical support? Are there support forums? Is the module commonly used, meaning that there are many people you may run into can answer questions for you? And then lastly is cost. Obviously, cost is typically a big driver also. And what you'll find is that costing on most of your entry-level TCMs is fairly competitive, and they're all priced about the same. Yes. There are. We actually have an iPhone, or sorry, we don't have an iPhone. We have an Android app. We're working on an iPhone app. We have an Android app now that allows you to do your transmission tuning for our simple shift TCM, which I'll get into here shortly. That TCM actually has an Android app for it. So it does require you to buy a Bluetooth interface kit for it, but it's relatively cheap.